It's 1896, and a ship called the Herbert Fuller leaves a Boston harbor on a voyage to the tropical climate of Buenos Aires, Argentina. There are 12 people on board, but within days of departure, only 9 remain, and one of them is a killer. So who on board is the culprit? Using the historic case file that becomes the starting point for the birth of the Miranda rights, historian Gerard Capel uncovers what really happened in his new book, Not a Gentleman's Work, the untold story of a gruesome murder at sea and the long road to truth.
The ship was going from Boston to Buenos Aires in July of 1896 with a load of New England pine lumber. There were 12 people on board. And 7 days out in this journey that would have been normally anywhere from 2 to 3 months, in the aft cabin at 2 o'clock in the morning, the captain, his wife, and the second mate were slaughtered in their separate rooms with the ship's axe.
To get a better understanding of the layout, the ship was divided into 2 cabins, with 6 people staying in one cabin with divided rooms. All 3 victims were in one cabin, and after the murders, 3 people were suspected of committing the crime. This included crewmen Charlie Brown and Thomas Bram and passenger Lester Hawthorne Monks.
After the discovery of the killings, and I want to put discovery in quotation marks because the person who discovered, quote unquote, the killings was the passenger. His name was Lester Hawthorne Monks from Boston, no relation to the author. And he supposedly discovered the killings. There had been 4 people asleep at the time, and 3 of them were killed, and Lester Monks was untouched, and he rushed on deck to tell the first mate about it.
On a ship with such close quarters, you might be wondering, how was someone able to kill 3 people? The public was puzzled, and theories surrounding the events of that night quickly spread. Capel says that many explanations defied logic and were generally unreasonable.
Initially, the first suspicion was centered on the helmsman. His name was, well, he had a long Swedish name, but he was called Charlie Brown. He had adopted that name early in his sailing career. He was a helmsman, and arguably he could have lashed the wheel, gone below into a cabin he'd never been in. The regular crew were never in the aft cabin. Found the axe. He would have had no idea where it was, killed 3 people, ignored a 4th, and then gone back up to the wheel and continued with the sailing of the boat, having been unnoticed by Thomas Bram, who was the first mate on watch on deck, who could look back and would have seen that there was nobody steering the boat.
Though Brown lacked a clear motive, he was suspended from duties and tied to one of the bottom masts of the ship for the remainder of the voyage. But the search for the killer didn't end there. With conflicting crew reports and the possibility of a large reward, the first mate, Thomas Bram, was also accused and put in chains.
There was a good reason why Thomas Bram might have been suspected, or at least accused, because if Bram, who succeeded to the command of the ship after the killing of the captain, had brought the ship in, that would have been it. If the crew brought the ship in, they might each have been eligible for roughly $500 in reward money apiece, which was an extraordinary amount of money, probably about 2 times as much as any of them earned in any given year. So there was some reason for the crew and the other survivors, including Lester Monks, to have decided amongst themselves that Bram was responsible.
Once back on land, Bram was seen as the primary suspect and put on trial for the murders. However, the prosecution presented no clear explanation of a direct motive.
It was said that possibly he wanted to take over the ship and take it to Cuba, where the beginnings of the Cuban Revolution were going on. But the argument was then made that if you want to take over a ship, you don't kill the wife of the captain or the second mate. It wasn't a good way to make friends with everybody else on the ship. And you don't do it without having any cohorts, and there was no suggestion that he did. So he had no motive. The helmsman, Charlie Brown, his motive might have been the motive of a person who's insane. He had a certain streak of insanity in him that was recorded both before and after this particular voyage.
The third suspect, passenger Lester Monks, also had no clear motive for the killings, but there were again many theories. Monks was an alcoholic who brought beer and alcohol with him on the boat and stored it in the same room as the murder weapon. Capel says some people theorize that Monks could have made a move on the captain's wife that, in his drunken haze, took a very wrong turn.
Later in life, Monks had some violence in a relationship with his first wife, which is fairly well documented. Perhaps it started here. He was drunk and annoyed that the captain's wife didn't want anything to do with him, and he chopped her up and then finished off the other two people in the cabin and went back to sleep, quote-unquote, for a couple of minutes, and then got up and alerted the first mate to the killings. It's possible. I would like to say that these killings happened in 1896. I would like to think that in my book I've come closer than anybody else has who has looked at this extraordinary triple killing to putting the finger on the correct killer, but I'm not sure it's possible that anybody will ever really know for sure.
Despite the lack of evidence, the public moved forward, and Bram was eventually convicted and sentenced to death. However, he appealed this decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's the events of this trial that go down in history.
The Supreme Court decides on appeal that this was a violation of Bram's Fifth Amendment, and they throw the verdict out. Bram gets a new trial. But in the history of Supreme Court jurisprudence, this becomes the first step on the way 80 years later to the Miranda case, in which the Supreme Court created the so-called Miranda warning that a defendant has the right to remain silent.
The Fifth Amendment states that no person can be compelled to be a witness against himself in a criminal case. This comes into play again many decades later in 1966, when Ernesto Miranda was arrested on charges of alleged kidnapping and rape. He was convicted of all charges based on a written confession he gave to police, despite never being advised of his right to an attorney. Miranda versus Arizona was one of 4 cases that paved the way for the enforcement of the Fifth Amendment. But none of it would have been possible without Thomas Bram.
The U.S. Supreme Court decided that, in fact, there is a right to silence, to remain silent, and also that you have a right to an attorney before you say anything that may be used against you, as the language goes in a court of law. But that famous Miranda warning, the road to it in the 1960s starts in 1896 or 1897 with the Thomas Bram case.
Though the Miranda rights protect people now, Thomas Bram and his shipmates were not so lucky. After a second trial, Bram was found guilty again, but historians still debate if he was the true culprit. For those who want to take a stab at cracking the case themselves, Capel says the full transcript of the trial is available online.
If anybody does, reads through those 5,500 pages and goes through the many dozens, perhaps even hundreds of newspaper accounts. This was lead story in Boston and throughout much of the United States and even overseas. If anybody wants to go through that and come up with more definitive results than I did, I welcome it. Nobody has definitively answered whodunit.
So after extensively researching and writing about the murder on the Herbert Fuller, who does Capel believe is the true killer? Read his book, Not a Gentleman's Work, The Untold Story of a Gruesome Murder at Sea and the Long Road to Truth, to find out. You can find the book on Amazon.com or request a copy through your local bookstore. To learn more about this topic and our guest, Gerard Capel, visit viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, check out Viewpoints Radio on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Kate Novak, Polly Hansen, and Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
Now there's even more reason to get flu and pneumonia shots. They may help cut the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Studies reported at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference 2020 show that flu vaccination, especially at a younger age, may cut Alzheimer's prevalence by 17%. And getting a pneumonia vaccine between age 65 and 75 may reduce Alzheimer's risk by up to 40%. Dr. Maria Carrillo is Chief Science Officer of the Alzheimer's Association.
Vaccines are at the forefront of public health discussions today, and these new studies suggest that their benefit goes beyond preventing viral or bacterial infections. If these findings can be confirmed in larger and more diverse groups, then taking care of your health by getting vaccinated may also lower your risk of Alzheimer's and other dementia.
What's more, growing research is investigating whether infections themselves might worsen or even cause dementia. Find out more at alz.org.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints. Coming up next week.
2/3 of people who are released from incarceration are then rearrested within a few years.
The incarceration epidemic. Then,
every major organ and system within the body and every process within the brain is wonderfully enhanced by sleep when we get it and is demonstrably impaired when we don't get enough.
The many interconnected benefits of getting restful sleep. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.